What I'm going to talk about is the state of the economy, the state of the consumer mindset, and I'm going to start off with an admission that I am biased or skewing it because it's so easy to look at the negatives at the moment. There's so much bad press around, there's so much negativity around that it can get a little bit tiresome talking about it, and I think there's an awful lot of positives out there, and not just looking at bricks and export opportunities. I think there's an awful lot of positives in the UK economy. And I think it becomes really easy to be too negative and it's just too easy to talk it down. So I'm going to try and pick up on some of the positives. Looking at 5 main areas: financial well-being, what that means for people's emotional well-being, how people have changed their attitudes towards spending and money management during the recession, what that means for how they've actually spent their money and how they plan to spend their money going forwards, and then the million-dollar question, when will the feel-good factor come back? So, financial well-being. All right, I'm going to try and be positive, but there are limits. You'd have to be pretty naive to pretend that everything is absolutely fine, and it is really difficult. And I guess you're going to know as well as I am that there's a lot of difficult stuff going on out there. So GDP, all right, the bright side is we're not in recession, but the downside is that any growth there is pretty anemic. Euro crisis is obviously undermining confidence for businesses and for consumers. Fiscal deficit is still high, so there's not much scope for the government to inject money, and there are cuts coming down the line, which obviously makes life more difficult for the consumer. What Mintel is all about is the consumer and understanding the consumer, though. So rather than look at the big picture macro stuff, I'm going to look at sort of the things that really affect consumers' well-being directly. Now, this is the obvious one to look at: unemployment. And again, you can see that peak there. Unemployment has started increasing again. That's obviously hugely bad news. But the first of my attempts to spin things positively, if you look at where we are compared to previous recessions, so early 90s, early 80s, actually unemployment's not nearly as bad. What is really difficult for consumers is this income squeeze they're facing. And I think this is probably the key slide. I have to shift from side to side so people in the room see different bits of it. This is probably the most important slide for understanding what's going on with consumers at the moment. So what we've got, this dark line here is RPI. The green line is average weekly earnings. Lord Young got himself in an awful lot of trouble a while ago for telling people that they've never had it so good during this so-called recession. He added to the unemployment statistics quite quickly afterwards. But he did actually have a very good point. So pre-recession, people were being squeezed. So RPI was running ahead of wage growth. We move into the recession here, wage growth dips quite sharply, but RPI falls even more quickly. So largely due to interest rate cuts. A lot of people had a lot more money in their pocket. So if you had a mortgage and if you still had a job, the chances are you were actually quite a lot better off than before the recession started. And this is the irony, and this is why I'm happy talking about recession here, but I think recession is quite a loaded word, and I think it's really difficult to use it when you're talking about consumers and the consumer mindset. So in theory, this is the recovery period. So GDP growth has anemically started increasing again. But as far as as far as the man in the street's concerned, at the same time RPI has risen really, really steeply, and wages just aren't keeping pace. So yeah, the economy is in recovery, but for me, for you, for everyone here, at the end of the month, whether GDP is growing, it doesn't make any difference to how much you got left. It's how much is left in your bank balance at the end of the month. And if prices are rising and wages aren't, then that makes life difficult. And this comes from our British Lifestyles report, which we ran late summer this year. We asked the main issues that were affecting people's financial well-being. And you can see it's this income squeeze all over again. So rising prices in shops, increased fuel costs, pay freeze cuts. These are the things that people are noticing and the things that's making life difficult for them. There. But all this comes with one huge caveat, that most people, even in the depth of the recession, in the worst recessions, most people are still getting by okay. So actually I was talking earlier about how Mintel does very well for press coverage. People often come to talk to us about consumer stories, and we put press releases out there, and you just know for a fact that if you say, grossing this up to the population, if you said that 5 million people are struggling or in trouble, that's what will get the headlines. If you say that 10 million people, actually their finances are really healthy, they've got money left over at the month for luxuries or to, to save a bit of money, that's just not a story. You just know that will never get picked up. So it depends on how media hungry we're feeling as to how we spin the press releases. But the main thing to remember is that actually about a fifth of people say their finances are healthy. Most of the rest get by absolutely fine. So only here, even here, this group here, they say things are tight, but they're still making ends meet. So yeah, there are people who are struggling to make ends meet, people who are in danger of falling behind, and there are people who are already falling behind. But the bulk of the economy, the bulk of the consumer base is actually still doing okay. Now, we've been picking up this sort of data for the last 2-3 years. Basically reinstates what we've shown before, so that's the recession there. That's when people actually were saying their finances would seem the most healthy. Ever since then, it's not collapsed. And again, important to remember, the income squeeze is gradual. It's not a sudden crisis point like losing your job. It just means that every month, it's that tiny little bit more difficult to get by. But it's not a sudden crisis point. So yeah, confidence is ebbing away slightly. People are slightly less likely to say they're doing well than they were, a year or two ago. But still, it's not crashing. Backing this up, I've got so much data that I could bore you with. I'm going to try and scoot through it. But basically, it's all saying exactly the same thing. So, financial situation compared to a year ago. There are slightly more people saying they're slightly worse off. But on the whole, it's pretty much the same. And it's stayed pretty much the same for the last last 6 months we've been tracking that. So, again, it's going to be the theme of this. It would be naive to pretend that everything's fine, but it's also, I think, slightly foolish to panic and think that everything's terrible and sort of try and withdraw from the markets. And what happens is, this goes back to this idea that it's the bad news stories that get picked up. So when you look at people's current financial situation and how it's changed over the last year or so, that's pretty constant. People aren't feeling that much worse than they were a year or so ago. But when you look at what people are thinking about in the year to come, that's when they start getting more worried. So they're not so great. They're more worried about the future than they were about the present. And again, this is really important. The slowdown and the income squeeze isn't hitting people to the same extent. I remember when the slowdown first hit, the recession first hit, the banking crisis kicked in. One of the few positives that anyone took from it was that the bankers would probably get hammered worse than anyone else. That hasn't happened. So, as always, if you're doing well, if you're relatively well off, if you're a high earner, you're able to find your way through the slowdown much, much more easily than the rest of the population. So it's higher earners, it's ABs that are doing best. And obviously, for anyone involved in the consumer economy, that's vital because they're the ones with the money to spend in the first place. What I think is really interesting is that families tend to be quite squeezed. My personal feeling is that that's a lot more to do with their employment situation than with their lifestyle. So yeah, it makes it more difficult to cut costs if you've got a family. But actually the people that are doing really well are the ones that are isolated from the job market. So full-time students, retirees. Uncertainty over the economy, I think, is undermining people's confidence to a large degree. So if you're out of that, then at least you've got a degree of stability and security. What does this mean for emotional well-being? Well, I think it's just quite interesting to get a feel for how miserable people are and whether everyone is as downbeat and depressed as a lot of the press coverage, a lot of the industry coverage might suggest. It's a moot point. So we asked people whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement, "I'm satisfied with my life." Half of people agreed, a lot of them were sort of sitting on the fence, not quite sure. Not that many people disagreed. So I think, on the whole, people are relatively positive. Now, we got a huge amount of press coverage out of this one, mostly for two reasons. And this is where I'm going to bully you into giving me some audience participation. So if you had to guess which part of the country was happiest, anyone got any ideas? South? Yorkshire. So all those... I was thinking about playing to the home crowd with that, but no. So all those cliches about dour Yorkshiremen, not true. They're the ones that are really happy. The cliche about money buying you happiness, unfortunately, probably is true. So the higher your earnings, the more satisfied you are with life. But again, you know, if you're targeting high worth markets, that's quite a nice thing. What is really obvious and what's really striking is that the general state of the economy and people's general state of finances does really, really strongly feed through into their sort of emotional well-being as well. So if your financial situation is healthy or okay, 2/3 of people say, you know, they're pretty satisfied with life. If it's not, if you're finding things tight or you're already struggling, that degree of happiness, you know, that drops so sharply. So just 3 in 10 are satisfied. So the economy does have a major impact on people's emotional well-being and their security. But then when it comes through to attitudes towards spending, I mean, this is where we start picking up some really interesting changes and some really interesting opportunities for people in the industry, in the markets. So first of all, the most obvious thing is that whenever a recession kicks in, the savings ratio jumps. So as you see, there's the recession, savings ratio suddenly increases really sharply. But I'm a geeky economist, so I look at things like that. The fact is that the savings ratio is slightly misleading. It doesn't actually measure how much people are saving. What it measures is what they're not spending. So again, it's slightly misleading. Savings balances aren't increasing that rapidly. Now you can see the polarisation in the market. So better off people are saving more. There's big inflows into equity investments, for example, because they're trying to avoid low interest rates. But for the mass market, savings balances are pretty much flat. And that's because a lot of what they're doing isn't about saving. It's about keeping a lid on debt and repaying debt. So here we have consumer credit over the last decade or so. Credit card lending increasing up to the middle of the decade. It's pretty much leveled off. So that's an injection of money that isn't coming into the economy. Other lending, mostly personal loans. Now that's the one that's really, really been hit since the slowdown. Partly that's due to, well, actually a lot of that is due to supply because people are wary of lending out on structured loans. But also there's a degree of consumer reluctance. People are trying to get their finances in order. And so borrowing money to make those big ticket purchases, I think at the moment feels very, very risky to a lot of people. Now this shows attitudes towards debts. And again, this is where I can start picking up on the positives. So I'm a little bit worried about the amount of debt that I've got. This is people with any sort of credit. So I'm a little bit worried about the amount of debt I've got. It's a third of people. So it's not non-trivial. You can't ignore it. But actually, it's not the crisis point that some people might suggest it is. Much more positive, I'm totally in control of my borrowing. So even people with debts, 2/3 of them are in control. So again, consumers aren't panicking, they're staying on top of things. The caveat for that is that they're not necessarily clearing a huge amount of debt. So credit card, new lending's flat. Outstanding balances, for example, it's slightly down, but not hugely. So there are people who are being pushed into borrowing more. It's not easy for people to clear debts, but that's definitely at the top of people's priorities. And here we get into the real meat of it and how people are changing their behaviours, how people are changing their attitudes towards money. Half of the population say that the recession has changed their approach towards borrowing money. Even more striking, about 2/5 say that if I can't afford to buy something, without borrowing money, then I won't buy it. Got about 16% of people who say, I tend to spend money now and worry about it later. So there's a real sense of prudence coming back in. People are realising that how they behaved in the run-up to the credit boom and in the run-up to the credit crisis was unsustainable. Short term, obviously, that makes life difficult. If people aren't borrowing money to spend, then that's money taken out of the economy. Long term, and hopefully most people are looking towards the long term rather than next month, 2 months down the line. Actually, I think that's a positive. If people's finances are in a better situation, then you've got a more stable consumer. And then what we did is we crunched those results. So all those attitudes towards borrowing money, towards managing your finances, how you approach your spending, created 3 mutually exclusive groups. Perhaps the least interesting is this one here, also the smallest group. They're well prepared. They're interesting for all of you because they're the ones with money. They're the ones that are doing really comfortably. Less interesting for me because I'm a research geek and they are just a little bit bunch of goody two-shoes. So there's not a lot you can say about them. They're doing well. They're relatively positive. They're relatively careful with their money. Great customers to have, but not that exciting from my point of view. The stretched, about exactly 37% of the population. They're slightly more interesting because they're not at crisis point yet. Some of them are, not all of them. They're just the people that are finding it that much more difficult to get by. So they're feeling a slight squeeze. It's not as easy as it was. Maybe they're starting to slightly struggle with their debts. This group, though, is really, really interesting. And I think this is where a lot of the potential comes in. And they really illustrate the shift in consumer mindsets over the last year or so. So that's the newly prudent group. I'll go through the 2 least interesting ones first. So the well-prepared, 43%, way above average, so their finances are healthy. They've got money left for luxuries or for saving at the end of the month. Almost all of them who've got debts are in control of their borrowing. They tend to be older, tend to be better off, tend to be child-free. I imagine probably quite good customers for Jaguar, so there's some positives for you there. What's interesting with them is that they haven't changed their attitude towards borrowing. I think their finances were fairly solid to begin with, so they've got no need to suddenly panic and sort of try and pay off credit cards, change behaviour. They were doing pretty well in the first place. And at the same time, they're not shunning credit to the same degree that a lot of people are. So they recognise that credit is a useful tool, that if you use it responsibly, it's actually it's a useful way of spreading the cost of purchases. So, they're steady as it goes, basically. The stretched, much more difficult group. Only 7% have got healthy finances. A lot of them are worried about the debt they've got. A lot of them actually have debt, and there's a real warning sign with personal loans. So whether it's cause or effect, whether the fact they've got a personal loan is what's really stretching them, or whether it's the fact they're stretched that has prompted them to take out a personal loan. Either way, personal loans are definite warning signs for their financial situation. They tend to be lower income groups, they're likely to have children. Obviously, it's just harder to cut spend if you have got children in there. There's less discretionary spend you can eliminate from your budget. 41% have had to borrow to make ends meet. Now, that has got to be a real worrying sign for them. As soon as you're forced into borrowing, then that's when debt problems start spiralling. That's when things become really difficult. Back to this one, from the research geek's point of view, the really interesting one, and I think the really promising one, and the one that tells us most about current thinking. So, 71% have reassessed their attitudes towards borrowing in the light of the recession. But the absolutely crucial thing is, they haven't had to. So you've got less than 1 in 10 who are either struggling or in trouble. So what they're doing, it's elective. They've chosen to change their approach to spending. It's not being forced on them. They just think it's a really good idea. I think it's the right thing to do. And as you can see, the newly prudent, you can look at their credit, their existing credit, what they've got out, their sort of balances. They have used credit in the past. Most of them have used it. They've got decent balances. So they've decided to change their approach. And as with any sort of new convert you'll meet, they are much more enthusiastic than most people. So almost all of them just say flat out, if I can't afford to buy something without borrowing money, then I won't buy it. So again, I think it's the passion of the new convert. But what it shows is that a lot of it is fashion driven. We picked up on a huge amount of this throughout the recession. So there's all sorts of categories that did really well. And remember, put this in the context that actually incomes are rising more quickly than prices, and a lot of people weren't that affected. But if you look at baking sales, absolutely rocketed. Now, I can tell you for a fact that, for a start, as a sad baker, it's a lot more expensive to bake your own cake than it is to go to the shop and buy one. And second, if you've lost your job, you're not worrying about how to save money by icing your own cupcakes. So it's a definite, the rise in baking, we picked it up in our data really, really strongly, and it was a direct result of the recession, but it was fashion-led, it wasn't necessity. And so that instantly gives you a key and sort of something you can work on in a way of reaching people, in a way of appealing to them. What also makes them so important is that 43% of them are women, much, much more likely to be women, and so obviously that's really important in terms of regular spends, the weekly shop. Really, it's classic Middle England. They're not, they're slightly older, slightly more affluent, but they're your everyman. Then moving on to how these changes, how these changing approaches have changed people's spending habits. Well, again, there's a limit to how optimistic I can be. So, things are difficult. Best Buy, joint venture with Carphone Warehouse, has been pulled. Thomas Cook, I guess every one of you will have heard the news about that today and how much they're struggling. Waterstones sold off for a song, HMV struggling, Argos really struggling. Game, I have arguments with our retail director about whether they're struggling or not. I think they are. He's not so sure, but that's because he's wrong. So I'm glad you agree. But all of these problems, all of these really high-profile problems, if you look at them, they've all got something in common, which is actually they're facing structural problems. So the recession makes it it's a really easy tag to hang on to it. So, you can say Argos are struggling because of the recession. You can say HMV is struggling because of the recession, but Thomas Cook is struggling. But the fact is that there are all other problems affecting them. So, Best Buy, you're trying to establish a new brand on the high street when people are trying to save money, and they're quite big ticket electrical items. So, that's always going to be really, really difficult. Thomas Cook, that is difficult. But again, you've got a changing consumer behaviour and move towards independent holidays rather than packaged holidays. So that's undermining Thomas Cook. HMV, Waterstones, Argos, Game, they've all fallen prey to the curse of Amazon. And that's got nothing to do with the recession. That's got to do with the fact that Amazon is actually a really, really good company, and you are always going to struggle if you go up against them. We have recently published Loop magazine, which we've got free copies here, and we're really, really proud of it. But what we've done is we've crunched our brand surveys for the first 6 months of the year, compared to 290 different brands. And Amazon, for a relatively new brand, have come out as the country's favourite brand. So, and that's all to do with customer service, to do with satisfaction and prices, but to a lesser degree nowadays. So already you see HMV, Waterstones, Argos, Game, you point at them as evidence of the recession, but actually it's just more evidence of coming up against a really, really tough competitor and changing purchasing patterns. What we're seeing in the retail sector, and actually across spending in general, is this idea of lifestyle essentials. People are prioritising what matters to them. They're spending cleverly. They're thinking more about what they're spending. If you haven't got cheap credit, if you haven't got easily available credit, if you are finding your income slightly more stretched, then you just watch what you're spending that little bit more. It doesn't mean you're not spending. You can see from spending data that Mintel's got, people are still spending money. They're just spending it more carefully. So you need to persuade them, you need to convince them, you need to give them a good reason to spend, but they are still prepared to spend. It's really interesting to see what they're sacrificing. So they're concentrating on their lifestyle, their day-to-day lifestyle. So holiday spend has been hit, and so from our travel analyst I checked today, overseas trips are down 20% since their boom period sort of 3-4 years ago. And it's difficult because a holiday is now, I think, seen by a lot of people as an essential, but it's 2 weeks of the year, and it's a lot of money. So you sacrifice that 2 weeks of the year, or if you trade down to a slightly cheaper holiday, go all-inclusive, for example, then that's a good amount of money that you can save, and then you can spend it on the things that actually change your life day to day, the things that you want to spend your money on, sort of to keep you going, to cheer you up, to keep your spirits up. And we're also seeing suggestions of an erosion in the mid-market. So people, again, are spending smart. So if there's something that you're not particularly bothered about, if you're not going for the premium brand, then why buy the mid-range? Why not just drop down to the cheapest on-demand display? Why not go to Poundland, I think? Yeah, exactly. So, you spend your money more smartly, more cleverly, make the most of what you have got to spend. But at the same time, at the top of the market, you spend your money more smartly. So a lot of premium things are doing quite well. And so it goes back to this lifestyle, sort of lifestyle essentials. So ready meals doing quite well, or top-end ready meals. All these little ways of treating yourself that, yeah, it's more expensive than the cheapest option out there. But if it gives you that lift in what is a fairly bleak time, then actually it's worth spending that money. And I mean, that goes all the way up to, pretty much big ticket items. So you're seeing that with high-end fashion as well. There's a lot of premium things that are doing quite well. What does that mean in numbers? I should say that anyone at the back, we'll make these slides available so you don't have to try and scrabble and see the percentages and the small type. What this shows, we've been running this for a while now. What people have bought, selection of big ticket items. So the things that you actually think about spending generally. What they bought over the last 3 months, which is the purple line, and then what they plan to buy over the next 3 months. It just shows so clearly that people are still spending money. So 41% of people have bought new clothes in the last 3 months. That's, there's no way that's an essential. That's not the sign of consumers that are panicking and cutting back hard. Booking a holiday. You can't deny that it's a difficult market at the moment, but a fifth of people have booked a holiday in the last 3 months. Going out for expensive meals, buying new electrical equipment, cultural events. People are still spending money on it. So people are still spending money on it, but it is against this background of prudence. So you can see here the biggest spend is on new clothes. Second most common area of spend over the last 3 months is adding to savings, and also you've got debts up there. So they're spending money, but they're making sure they spend it sensibly, and they're trying to make sure they're not overextending themselves. This is really interesting. This shows, because we've been running this over the last few months, we can compare what people said they were going to do 3 months ago with what they say they did in October. The numbers are up there so that when you look at the slides you can actually get the detail of it. This is probably the easiest way of looking at it. So this compares the two. This is the difference between what people said they were going to spend their money on 3 months ago and what they actually did spend their money on over those 3 months. People are really good at predicting some of their spend. So electricals, holidays, white goods, expensive meals, holidays even, repaying debts. They're actually, they were pretty accurate. They said they were going to spend that money on that, and the same proportion did actually spend it. Where they're way out of line is on clothes in particular, and that's been consistent all the time we've run this survey. People are awful at judging how much money they're going to spend on their clothes. So, and this is where I can go against gender stereotypes, having gone to buy a suit the other week and spend quite a lot more than I expected on it. So it's not just women who aren't very good at controlling their clothes spend. It's us as well. Yeah, I might skate on that.
Can I ask though, seriously, is that split gender-wise? Is it consistent across both sexes, or is it out with women?
We've got the data. Well, I mean, any questions like this, if you want to come back to me at the end, then if you give me the card, I'll give you my card, and you can. We have got it. So, what does this tell us about people? Well, what's interesting as well is where they're not spending money. So, where they said we're going to spend money on the home, they didn't tend to. New car, concert to a slightly less degree, but again, it's these big ticket items, and it all ties back to this theme of lifestyle essentials. So, very, very few people absolutely have to replace their kitchen now. Like, it's always something you can put off quite easily. Like, you know, you might live with a slightly grotty kitchen for a few months, but you don't need it here and now, and it's not going to make a huge difference to your life if you don't buy it. A new car, I mean, obviously everyone would love a shiny new beautiful Jaguar, and it will make a huge difference to their lives if they do buy one. But it is, for other lesser cars, you can probably delay it a little bit longer. So those are all ways of, you know, this smart shopping, people delaying spending and putting off spending on products that they don't need right now in favour of things like clothes. So you buy a new outfit, you give yourself an instant lift. It sort of cheers you up. Savings as well. If you put an extra few quid into your savings account, that gives you that security. And I think security, stability, that element of certainty is so important in an uncertain world. The big question, what does it mean for Christmas, and sort of going on beyond that. We've got an easy positive, which is actually, from a research point of view, a totally cheating positive. But the one good thing is that it's a really easy comparison compared to last year. So last Christmas it was snowy, had real weather problems, so that depressed sales. So this year automatically, when you see the headlines in January about how Christmas sales are gone, it's going to look better purely because of that comparison. See in a moment that tracker spend suggests that people are preparing to spend and they're gearing up for Christmas. The latest retail sales were actually fairly good. And speaking to our Director of Retail Research, he puts an awful lot of that down to discounting. So people will go and shop and people can be persuaded to go and spend. You've got to be quite savvy about it and you've got to give them a good reason to do it. But if you give them a good enough reason, they will go out there and spend. Yeah, so it's discounting is bringing a lot of people into the shops. So our Director of Retail, his prediction is for an uplift about sort of 4 to 5% at Christmas, which isn't amazing, and I think for the retailers in particular, the amount of discounting they might have to do to get that level of spend isn't going to mean that their bottom line isn't going to be quite as strong as that figure would suggest, but it's broadly positive. This is that tracker data on what people are going to be spending their money on over from May through to October. And the four biggest areas of increase in spend, I think, show that people are getting ready for Christmas and are anticipating it. So, biggest uptick, clothes. So, it's a classic gifting item, but also getting ready for the Christmas party. You've also, that wasn't meant to be funny. That's just why I bought my new suit, I'd say. Anyway, thank you all the same. Going out for an expensive meal, obviously gearing up towards maybe Christmas parties, sort of office Christmas do's. Buy new electrical equipment, obvious gift area, so games consoles, hi-fis, everything. That's an obvious reason to be preparing for Christmas. But again, bang home my point with tedious repetition, it also came with an uptick in reducing non-mortgage debts. So everything's being done with this prudence in mind. People are prepared to spend, but they've got in the back of their mind, right, I know things aren't great, I want to have a good Christmas, but I can't let myself, I can't let it run away from me, I need to stay in control. And if I knew the answer to this for sure, when the feel-good factor is going to return, then I'd probably be looking for a job at Goldman Sachs rather than at Mintel. But I can give it a good go. If you want the optimistic answer, then don't ask consumers, because they're really not that optimistic. I'd love to know, like we asked when the feel-good factor is going to return, I'd love to know which 2% of the country think the feel-good factor is already here, because, well, it must be quite a nice place where they are. 4% think it's going to be within the next 6 months, 7% 6 months to a year. So there's really, people are fairly pessimistic. By far the biggest group. People who think that it's going to be longer than 2 years before the feel-good factor comes back. Now, 2 years seems like quite a long time already, especially when you say, well, that's pushing it into 2014. Add that to how long we've been in recession for. So the financial crisis broke in 2007, 2008, depending on when you want to start it from. So, you're looking at well over half a decade of austerity, pretty relentless bad news. That sort of thing, it's no wonder that people have changed their habits. and it's no wonder that people are rethinking their finances. And there's always an argument how deeply this affects consumers and how long these changes in behaviour are going to last. If it is 6-7 years of austerity, that's bound to leave scars on people's psyche. That is going to change people's approaches. I don't believe in the sort of forever. This is going to fundamentally change consumers, the whole new paradigm thing. I think people behave in a certain way and they drift back towards that way. They sort of oscillate around a central point. But I don't think that you're going to see a sudden spring back in confidence as soon as the recession ends, as soon as that feel-good factor does come back. People have taken this on board and are changing their habits. So consumers aren't particularly cheery about it all. And it is incredibly easy to build a doomsday scenario. You shut your eyes now if you want to stay positive, but the Eurozone crisis has huge potential to derail things. Unemployment, it's lower than it was in previous recessions, but it is gradually rising. Wages are flat, rents are up, so that's more of the income squeeze. The austerity measures, to a degree, are still to bite, so you've got more money being taken out of the economy from the government. The real danger is that if the private sector doesn't generate enough jobs to compensate for the jobs that are being lost from the public sector, is that the right way around? Yeah. That then makes life really even more difficult. Global slowdown would affect the UK. And actually, on a consumer level, a basic consumer level, there is only so long you can keep on savvy shopping. At some point, if your income keeps on being eroded, then you do actually have to start cutting into muscle, not fat. So yeah, it's easy to make the negative case. Much more interesting to make the positive case and taking the devil's advocate view. So here are the positives. For a start, inflation should start falling soon. VAT drops out at the end of the year, so that gives an instant boost. There's not a lot of scope for the government to boost spend, but there is some there. So you look at the initiative the other day, increasing house building, supporting first-time buyers. Now that then, as a good economist, you know about the multiplier effect, so that then feeds through into the broader economy. You get construction jobs, they spend money, you end up with a virtuous cycle. So, even relatively small changes could boost the economy. Interest rates, they're still drawing a line under borrowing costs, so if you've got a mortgage, you've got used to your payments, so you don't get, when interest rates first dropped, it was great, you really notice it, and it's the same as a pay rise, so first couple of months, it's brilliant, yeah, that's great. After a couple of months, it's just gone. So you don't have that instant boost with mortgage rates, but it's still low borrowing costs by historical standards. This, I think, is really important. The hat trick of Jubilee, Euro 2000, the Olympics. I think that's got the potential to really boost sentiment. Jubilee maybe less so, Euro 2000 to a degree, but the Olympics, I'm positive about the Olympics. I think you've got 3 weeks next summer where the whole country, especially if the athletes do well, the whole country is united. We've got the entire focus of the world on London. And also, just from a purely regional point of view, London drives so much of the UK economy that even if it is a relatively localised effect, that will still feed through to the rest of the country. So, yeah, the Olympics, those 3 things, I think you get short-term hits to retail because people are staying in to watch it. But actually, if that gives a real boost to consumer confidence, and I've got an ex-girlfriend of mine who's Australian, she was in Sydney during the Olympics when that was held there, and she was talking about the huge effect it had on Sydney and just sentiment across the whole country. And it's little things like that, just that little boost that consumers might need to pick themselves up slightly. And the key point about consumers, they've shown they're hugely resilient. We've gone through what is, technically speaking, one of the worst recessions we've faced in the UK. And you go back to one of those first slides, you've still only got 3% who are in real trouble. So most people have faced an awful lot of problems and they're adjusting really well. They are very, very resilient. They're tough. So I'm almost done. We can almost get back to the crisps and beers. And this is where I have to refer to my notes, I'm afraid. So people are changing behaviour, but a lot of those changes are voluntary and they're open to persuasion. You can talk them into, you can't fool them into buying something they don't want to buy, but you can persuade them. You can give them a good reason to spend that money. Lifestyle essentials, they're going to thrive. And at the same time, you've got this return to traditional values. So with traditional budgeting, traditional money management, you can see it spreads over into the whole economy. So baking, for example, the TV success of the year, you've got the Great British Bake Off. That's absolutely a return to the 50s. It's this real dive back to more traditional values, sort of more old-fashioned way of doing things. It's an easy refuge to move to the past when the present is really difficult. So that's one message you can put across to your customers. Just try and play on that, value, traditional nature of things. And here's my straw poll of our office, Mintel's consumer experts. I asked what's done really well and what's going to be doing really well. And it's amazing how consistent the answers are in terms of this lifestyle essentials. So, small thing, coffee pods, apparently done brilliantly and are forecast to grow really strongly over the next year or so. And again, it's a really small thing, but it's a little indulgent. If you trade down from your Starbucks coffee, you've still got a nice, easy, posh cup of coffee to have. Ready meal segments, upper end of the ready meal market, that's done really well. It's another affordable treat, and that feeds through to baking as well. It's just a little indulgence that's quite easy to spend, makes yourself feel that a little bit better. Ready-to-drink cocktails. A huge part of the consumer economy now is, the fact is that most people have got pretty much everything they need. So once you've got all the stuff you need and you're running out of room to put all that stuff, then people go for new experiences. And, ready-to-drink cocktails at home, it's another way of getting a new experience. It's a way of sort of taking yourself out of the day-to-day, finding something different to do. Luxury clothing, we talked about my weakness for expensive suits. Never go suit shopping with a hangover. That's my lesson for the last 6 months. But, I'm not a fashion expert, but surprising, some of these high-end retailers are doing really well. There's a lot of new high street openings for quite high-end retailers. So it's, that investment purchase angle. This is why I've had to print it out, where I'm on very, very shaky ground. Now, has anyone heard of the lipstick index?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's as far as I got. I had actually heard of it, which the theory is that in tough times, people go out and buy lipsticks because it's it's an affordable way to lift your mood. Now, speaking to our health and beauty expert, Mintel, groundbreaking as ever, has refined the whole concept of the lipstick index. And her words, today I think of the lipstick index as encompassing colour cosmetics in general rather than just lip colour. You can see why I'm having to read this off. but apparently, if the lipstick index is up, people are spending money on, again, it's these affordable treats. And it's out of my depth, but apparently you're getting retail theatre with new product innovations, which is driving traffic. And there's a lot of activity in nail colour with funky finishes, including polish that works with magnets to create unexpected designs. But I've got to say, this is where my geeky side kicks in, because I'm thinking, nail varnish with magnets. I could actually, that might be the way to expand a category. Just make it geeky enough for blokes to try it. So yeah, there are positives. Now, finish off on, I'll even try and be optimistic about these big ticket purchases, which are really difficult. People are delaying big ticket purchases, but another advantage of Mintel is we've got a huge heritage. We go back sort of 30 odd years. And so when the recession started, I looked back to previous reports. And you could see that one of the really noticeable things is that when the recession bounces back, then it's these delayed purchases that bounce back really, really quickly. So people, you don't need to buy a new washing machine, but when the economy picks up, actually, you'd quite like to get rid of that one you've had for the last 8 years. So, even there, when the economy picks up, and it will pick up, like whatever doomsday scenarios you have, things will get better. Whether it's a year, 2 years' time, it will happen. So, there are positives out there, a lot of them, I think. Minor plug. A lot of this information has been drawn from this, which if you give us your contact details, it's one of the few things Mintel gives away for free. So we can send you a copy and you can have a look at the actual numbers behind this all. There you go. Thank you very much for your time.